Mr. Scott.
Good morning, my lady. May we call Naomi Long?
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
Good morning. Would you please provide your full name?
Naomi Rachel Long.
And for the purposes of today, I'll refer to you as Mrs. Long throughout. Thank you for providing the assistance to the inquiry. For the benefit of the stenographer, can I ask you to keep your voice up, but not speak too quickly?
Okay.
You provided a witness statement dated the 12th of March 2024. That's up on screen at the moment. Your signature and the statement of truth is at page 68. Please can you confirm the contents of that statement are true?
I can, yes.
And you're content to rely upon that statement in evidence of the inquiry?
I will, yes.
If I just summarise your political career to date. So you became an elected representative for the Alliance Party in May 2001 when you were elected to Belfast City Council. You served until June 2010, including a term as Lord Mayor in 2009-2010. You were first elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly in November 2003. Became the Alliance Party Deputy Leader in 2006 and was re-elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2007. You became an MP in 2010 before you were re-elected to the Assembly in 2016 and became Alliance Party Leader later that same year. You took up a seat in the European Parliament in 2019, and then following your EU exit, you were co-opted back into your Assembly seat on the 9th of January 2020 and was elected as Minister of Justice on the 11th of January 2020 when the Executive and Assembly were restored.
That's correct.
I'd like to start off with some questions about the Executive Committee as a body and how it operates and your experiences of that. You say in your statement that structures of government in Northern Ireland not only enable instability, but also a barrier to efficient and effective decision-making when the executive is in place. Could you please provide a practical example that's related to the response to the pandemic in Northern Ireland of how that operated?
Yes, there were a number of examples where I believe that the structures that we had in place made cooperation and collaboration more difficult than would have been the case had normal decision-making rules applied. I think the most stark example was the week of the 9th of November, where we had the use of the parallel consent mechanism vote within the executive. So on the Thursday or Friday of that week, when we met, all of the restrictions that were in place were due to fall. Sorry to
interrupt. If I could just ask you to speak a little bit slower.
Okay.
Just from the start. I've already been told once this morning, so.
Apologies. When we met that week, we knew that on the Thursday or Friday of that week, that all of the restrictions that were in place as part of the circuit breaker would fall, were the executive not to make a decision about what restrictions would remain in place. The Health Minister brought recommendations to the executive. The DUP indicated they would not support those recommendations. They didn't only vote against them, however, they triggered a parallel consent vote within the executive.
Could you please explain what that is for those who aren't familiar?
So in order for us to pass the recommendations, we needed, first of all, a majority of members voting at executive, and then ancillary to that, we also needed a majority of unionist members to vote for and a majority of nationalist members to vote for.
And some people might know that as the cross-community vote, and to give it very shorthand.
Yes. And it effectively operated as a veto. So the Health Minister's proposals, because the DUP were the majority of unionists on the executive, they were in a position to block the Health Minister's proposals. By contrast, if we had taken a decision by simple majority or even weighted majority voting in the executive, we would have had a true cross-community representation. So Sinn Féin, SDLP, Alliance and Ulster Unionist would all have been in favour, and it would have been an inclusive vote, and the Health Minister's recommendations would have passed. Instead, we entered into a period of rather chaotic and, frankly, embarrassing horse trading to try to find a solution to the fact that we were blocked from accepting the Health Minister's recommendations.
If I can just bring you back to your experiences of the use of that. You've indicated that the simple majority voting, effectively that would have passed with the support of the Ulster Unionist Party, Alliance, SDLP and Sinn Féin. So 4 out of the 5 parties that were sharing power.
Correct.
And so you say, effectively, that would have demonstrated clear cross-community support, but for one party voting against it.
Correct.
You also have indicated the fact that the Health Minister was a unionist and his proposals were vetoed by other unionists. What was your view on the use of a mechanism in that way in the middle of a public health emergency?
I felt it was an egregious abuse of a process that was there in order, conceived in order to protect minorities around issues of particular sensitivity in Northern Ireland. So, for example, constitutional issues, issues to do with language and culture, and issues to do with the Good Friday Agreement itself. Instead, it was being deployed, first of all, on an issue that had no differential bearing on either community. So anyone in society could get COVID and be affected by COVID. It did not recognise people's constitutional aspirations. And therefore, the cross-community, if you like, demand seemed to be irrelevant in that context.
Can I just ask you one point that you also made? If, say, you had been Health Minister at the time, would you have been able to vote on your own proposal?
I would have been able to vote, but my vote would have been discounted in the context of whether or not a majority could be achieved. So we would have been in the invidious position where the minister who brought the proposal, actually their vote counted for less than other ministers.
So some people might not necessarily understand the precise mechanism of that. So when it comes to, I'm going to use the Parliament's cross-community vote, that all ministers have the opportunity to vote.
Correct.
But unless a minister, when they became an MLA, designated as unionist or nationalist, that actually their vote wouldn't count for the purposes of the tally.
It would count for the first, so there are 2 clauses that have to be met, 2 conditions to pass. The first is a majority of the executive, it counts. The second is a majority of unionists and a majority of nationalists, it doesn't count. The other issue, if I may, which I think is important to say in this, that this was not about a protection of a minority. The DUP were the largest party on the executive. They were also deploying it against a minister who was of the same designation, so also a unionist, which to me shows starkly how egregious that breach of and abuse of the mechanism was.
There were at the time 10 ministers who were able to vote within the executive, and given that your vote wouldn't have been counted on that second limb of the cross-community, there were 9 ministers. How many DUP ministers made up that 9?
4, I think.
I just wanted to come back then to your experiences of actually being the executive, not on the 9th of November. You set out in your statement frustrations that were experienced by yourself and also by Minister Mallon. It's right that Minister Mallon was the only member of the SDLP on the executive at that time.
That's
right?
correct.
And so both of you were effectively individuals alone in the executive.
We were.
And plainly, Mr. Swan was also in the same position. But then again, as Health Minister, he had the Department of Health working alongside him in response to the pandemic. So a slightly different position, would you agree?
Very much so. We were very reliant as an executive on his recommendations, and therefore when papers were brought, recommendations were being brought, the Health Minister was, I think, viewed to be crucial in those discussions.
You talk about there being pre-negotiations. between the First Minister, Deputy First Minister and Minister Swan. What was your understanding of the point of those pre-negotiations?
Well, first of all, it was my impression throughout that those pre-discussions had become negotiations. We were told that was not the case repeatedly at executive, but it clearly was the case. And now, in light of the evidence that the inquiry has exposed, first of all, we can see that the civil service themselves recommended that they would find a consensus with the First and Deputy First Minister before bringing things to the executive, in order that things would go more smoothly at the executive.
Can I just come in there? Is it necessarily detrimental for civil servants to try and identify where consensus might lie between the 5 parties that make up the power sharing arrangement?
Not at all, but they did not do so with the 5 parties that made up the executive. They did so with the First and Deputy First Minister's party and with the Health Minister, to the exclusion of 2 of the parties who were in the executive. I believe that was detrimental, and I think the evidence would demonstrate that it was. Issues that were raised by myself and by Minister Mallon were often batted away despite their validity, on the basis that to pull on that thread may unravel a consensus that had been reached in another meeting prior to the executive meeting. And as a result, some, I think, valid input that we had to make to the decision-making process was not fully engaged.
Because a power sharing arrangement of 5 parties isn't a full power sharing arrangement when 2 of them are excluded.
Correct.
And in terms of the actual administrative aspects, I think you were set out things like you were getting the papers very, very late in the day, so you didn't have an opportunity to consider them. You didn't have an opportunity, given the rules of confidence, to actually share them with your party members, whereas those who had more than one minister were able to discuss them amongst themselves. Did you feel disadvantaged in terms of your ability to engage with the issues as a minister?
To some degree, we were disadvantaged. I mean, at a very practical level, not being able, for example, to seek detailed advice from my officials made it very difficult for us to provide responses in a timely fashion. It was also very isolating because we were taking decisions which would have a huge impact on people's lives, and yet were not part of the wider conversation. But were expected to, in many cases, rubber stamp negotiations that others had had, but then take full responsibility for those decisions, though we didn't have a hand in forming them. And that, I think, was incredibly frustrating.
We've heard a number of references to leaks coming from the Executive Committee. What was your view of the impact of those leaks?
I think first and foremost, it created at times panic.
Amongst who?
In the public. I think things were leaked in terms of what may or may not happen at executive, that then created a debate prior to executive having been able to even consider the evidence around what may or may not happen. And I think that that created a sense, first of all, that the executive was incompetent. And secondly, it led to me finding out often from journalists or news reports what would be discussed at executive, as opposed to finding out when I received my papers and my briefings.
Do you think that the point of those leaks was to effectively trail a proposal to see either what the public support would be, or to try and push people into supporting a proposal?
It's very difficult to know what the motivation was. I think in some cases it was slightly more benign, in that I think people were trying to prepare the ground, if you like, for what might be coming down the line. In other cases, I think that there was a degree of leaking of information, mainly negative information, to put pressure on ministers to take certain positions.
Could you give us specific a specific example of that, please?
There were so many examples of leaks, it's hard to recall a single example where that influence was obvious, but I would say particularly around the circuit breaker, some of the leaking at that time into the press was particularly to ramp up pressure for people to agree to certain proposals. But the leaks were not consistent in that regard. There would have been other times when there would have been leaks from people who were making clear that they were not going to do certain things. There was also, in addition to leaks of the facts, if I may.
I don't want to cut across you.
Yeah.
Just, I've got a number of topics I want to cover, and I just want to make sure we're focusing on those. If I can just take you forward to alignment. I heard a number of people refer to alignment with the United Kingdom or the Republic of Ireland. Given your viewpoint within the executive, what do you consider would have been the optimal, let's use the word alignment, for Northern Ireland in a pandemic towards either the Republic of Ireland or the United Kingdom, or a blend of both?
I was quite pragmatic about how we should handle the pandemic. As I set out in my written evidence, I think there were a number of practical factors that would influence how we could do that. So our scientific guidance came from UK SAGE, and therefore was not going to entirely coincide with the advice being offered in the Republic. Not all of the actions required to align across the island would lie within the competence of the devolved institutions. So even if we aspired to align, we would not have had the powers necessarily to do so.
Such as?
Particularly around international travel, which is not a devolved matter. Thirdly, I think our budget for dealing with COVID, so the resource available to us, was very much guided by spend in England in particular, and the Barnett consequentials that we got from that. So if we wanted to do things in line with the South, we wouldn't have necessarily always had access to the resource to do it. We were very conscious that those living in border communities could see conflict. You know, if you're living in Strabane and you see schools in Lifford closed and a mile down the road in Strabane schools are open, that conflict was very live. And there would have been, I think, simplicity in having more cohesion in terms of our approach.
And just to illuminate that point you're making between Lifford and Strabane, the border in an area like that is very fluid. People transferring backwards and forwards for work, schools, shopping. So it would feel like their daily lives had been impacted. Is that fair? Correct.
And people whose lives straddle the border were also having to be able to manage two often different sets of regulations and restrictions, two different sets of guidance. And so that was complex. And I suppose the added complication for Northern Ireland was that there did not appear, certainly from my perspective, to be adequate thought given by either the Irish government or the UK government about the impact of divergence in their approach on a part of the UK that had a land border with the neighbouring state. And it would be fair to say that that's a fairly consistent failing in UK policy making, because there are no land borders in that way to consider for the rest of the UK for GB.
Did that put the executive in a difficult position in the sense that at times significant announcements could be made either from Westminster or from Dublin, which then the executive would have to react to?
Very much so. Those decisions were often made with little or no advance warning. So I recall we knew that, for example, something akin to a lockdown might emerge, but I found out about it when Boris Johnson made his public statement on television. We found out about the Irish lockdown when I think Leo Varadkar made the announcement from Washington. So we were not prepared in advance, but understandably, the media then immediately said, well, what are you going to do? And we had to try to reconcile both of the other jurisdictions, what they were doing, how that would impact on us, how we would manage that internally, and do that at speed.
Are you able to exercise the level of leadership you would have liked to as a minister in those situations?
Well, I think leadership is about how you respond in situations. It was certainly not, I wouldn't describe it as the optimum situation for demonstrating leadership, but I think that is the nature of leadership, that it's often how you respond in those challenging situations that defines whether or not you are leading. I think at times, whilst it appeared to the public that we were reactive, we were following the advice and guidance given to us to the best of our ability and seeking as best we could to show leadership within our own community, bearing in mind that the trajectory of COVID in Northern Ireland was not the same as in England or the South.
So just moving slightly onwards in terms of, let's call it visible leadership or engagement with the leadership, about public statements. There's one in particular that seemed to have an impact upon the executive in and around the 14th of March, after the Republic of Ireland had taken the decision to close schools. And Michelle O'Neill made a public statement setting out that there had been contradictory medical evidence and that her view was that we, obviously in Northern Ireland, should err on the side of caution, and it's the duty to make decisions in the interest of everyone based on all available advice. From your perspective, was a public statement at that time, in March 2020, detrimental to public confidence or actually boosted public confidence?
This was a matter of public debate, so it would be fair to say there were already divergences in opinion. It was a matter of debate in the media. So people were already reaching a degree, if you like, of discussion around this, irrespective of any public statement. But I believe that it did undermine confidence fundamentally in the advice we were given. The advice that we received collectively as an executive was that it was not necessary at that point in time to close schools. And from my perspective, I believed that it was important that we acknowledged that that was the case and that we collectively reached a decision as to when schools would be closed.
Can I just ask then, in principle, there's no difficulty with ministers making public statements by themselves. Do you agree with that?
Well, we are all bound by the ministerial code, and so when we have made decisions, we are bound by those decisions, and we are also bound to defend those decisions. I could point to numerous examples of decisions with which I disagreed, but that I defended publicly.
But that relies upon a decision having been taken. So on the 14th of March, the executive hadn't taken a decision whether or not to close schools. Is that right? That came on the 16th.
It does, but I think also there is an expectation in the ministerial code that the negotiations around the executive table remain confidential. So if you publicly state going into the executive your prejudged position, it's very hard then for other executive colleagues not to do likewise. And you end up with an executive debate in the public arena, which is not necessarily helpful. It was also, from my perspective, we all agreed that we should err on the side of caution at that stage. In fact, the Department for Education said that we should not be blasé very early in this. I disagreed with the immediate closure of schools, but I also disagreed, I have to say, with the DUP counter to that, which was we should not close schools until the CMO recommended it, because there are other factors to consider. I've mentioned the border as an example. So we started to see school management in Northern Ireland, the Catholic maintained school sector, saying that they believed schools should be closed. We saw parents start to withdraw their children voluntarily from school because they saw schools closing elsewhere. And so I don't think it was purely a decision to be taken on the basis of medical evidence, but we needed to look at how, as an executive, we could maintain support from the community and take into account the views of the community as we proceeded.
That sounds like you're considering the balance between the medical evidence and then societal factors. Do you think that the executive was given sufficient information about societal factors throughout the pandemic, particularly in the early stages?
Well, there were a number of pieces of evidence that we were given. So we were provided with potential societal impacts. We were provided with economic information in terms of impact. We were also very conscious of the impact, for example, on older people, people with disabilities, vulnerable groups, in terms of one of the motivations for entering lockdown was to protect those particular groups. But I think, and I've expressed, I think in my statement, the degree to which we had the same level of expert input to executive decision making when it came to societal, human rights, equality, and other impacts, I think was not so extensive as the health information. So the Chief Scientific Officer, the Chief Medical Officer were regular attendees at executive and were able to elucidate their arguments.
Can I just take you to some of the examples of some of the documents that you're talking about, the fact that you received? Because there's clearly a distinction between receiving a document and actually the document content being sufficient to provide you as a minister with enough information to take a decision. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's true. And as I said, I felt that we lacked the same level of expertise in terms of informing our decisions from those other sectors as we gained from the Department of Health. That's not to say they weren't considered, but the weight we could attribute to them was affected by the lack of an equal weight of expert advice.
On the 9th of November 2020, you wrote a letter to your executive colleagues and you're saying that the inability of modelling to disaggregate the impact of different parts of the economy, society at a more granular level remains a weakness in our ability to consider the likely impact of more nuanced restrictions. Even in November, are you suggesting that actually the modelling didn't provide you with the information that you needed?
No. There was a desire within the executive at that time to look at intrasectoral differentiation. So, for example, within close contact services, to look at hairdressing versus driving instructors versus nail technicians. And the point I made was that the modelling was not sufficiently nuanced, and Dr. Ian Young had been very clear. It was not sufficiently nuanced for us to be able to understand what the impact of, for example, closing hairdressers but opening up driving tests again
would that not have been very useful to have a greater detail about what the impact would have been on specific sectors when you're considering whether to open or close?
Well, there are two things that I would say. First of all, given that the impact on the R number was relatively small for many of these sectors, to further disaggregate it, you then end up with a situation statistically where the confidence in the information you're using declines as the number of as the nuance increases. So from a modelling perspective, I understood that in a situation where you're dealing with a relatively small sample, if you then split that sample into very small parts, the confidence that you can have in how representative that disaggregation is declines. Yep. And so It wasn't whether or not it would have been useful to have, but whether or not it was practical to be able to deliver. And I don't believe, in fairness, that we could have delivered the level of disaggregation of sectors in terms of the R number that some people were looking for. We could tell in broad terms the likely impact of close contact services or hospitality, but we couldn't necessarily go kind of we couldn't go, I guess,
The
by
balance
each
between coffee shops
individual.
or restaurants, for example, which was a point that had been raised.
Incredibly difficult.
Yes, but isn't the difficulty, as you highlight in November, we're not talking about the low rates in the middle of the summer, for example, we're talking in November when the transmission rates are high. Isn't the difficulty that if you haven't got a proper disaggregation of the impact on the different parts of society, you actually can't tell whether your assessment of what the impact on the R number would be, as you just suggested, is. You actually need that aggregation to then identify whether your modelling is correct.
I think there are two things I would say. First of all, one of the things that I pressed for throughout, which I think would have been helpful, was that as we emerged from the first lockdown, that we did so in cycles of 3 weeks, because we were told it took around 3 weeks for the imposition of restrictions to lead to a lowering of R, and equally as we lifted to see a change. And I wanted to move in 3-week blocks for a couple of reasons. It gave people the opportunity to see the impact of the changes we were making. And that would also have allowed us, if we reached a point where the R rate, when we were reliant on that for a period, was increasing, we could take one step back. But the rush to open things up in a more chaotic fashion meant that we couldn't tell as we emerged whether the changes that we were making, which parts of the changes we were making were actually having the impact that we were seeing on the R rate. So I think we lost an opportunity by not being more coherent and restrained as we moved out of lockdown. Not that I wanted to move slower for slowness sake, but because I felt that by doing so in a much more coherent and steady fashion would allow us to acquire that information that we would then need if at a later stage, as expected, we needed to impose further restrictions.
Okay, if I can just show you a document, it's INQ 000 346707. This is a briefing paper dated the 17th of June 2020, and it's about one of the reviews of restrictions that had to take place. You'd be very familiar with these types of documents, no doubt. And then if we can go through to page 7, please. Now, the purpose of this document, if I'm correct, was to pull together all the various threads to inform you as ministers about an overview of the state of the regulations, the state of transmission, the impact of the restrictions, and allow you to take a decision about what should be done next. Is that a fair summary of what the point of this paper is? Yes. So we have a section here above paragraph 36 that's called Wider Health, Societal and Economic Impacts. And we can see that paragraph is all about economic impacts. If we can go over the page, please. And then there's paragraph 37. Now, again, it's worth remembering this is the paper's dated the 17th of June 2020, so it's not the first iteration of a paper such as this. Do you consider that that paragraph 37, which appears to be the extent of the consideration of the wider societal impacts, do you think that gives you sufficient information in order to take a decision about what to do with the restrictions?
Well, I wouldn't characterise it as you have, as representing all the consideration of the wider societal impacts. It was certainly the consideration that the Department of Health had undertaken of the wider societal impacts. But these papers then came to the executive, and we also raised issues. So, for example, a consistent theme that I raised was around the balance between the economy and wanting to protect our economy, but also looking at wider societal impacts that were not economically driven. And there were at times, I think, conflicts at two levels. Firstly, I think that when it came to how we decided to prioritise.
If I could just please ask you just to focus on the specific question I'm asking in relation to this document, because it's about the information that you were provided with rather than the information that you were necessarily imparting. Because this document is meant to inform all ministers in advance of a meeting, is that correct?
From a health perspective, yes.
Yes. So were there equivalent papers from everybody else that were setting out the impact from all of their departments, or is effectively this the summary?
There would have been other papers in circulation and correspondence in circulation at that time that would have raised other concerns. I mean, I wrote about other issues that were of concern to me, that I had picked up either as a constituency, MLA, or as a minister. For example, the impact it was having on young families, the impact it was having on single people, the impact it was having on bereaved families.
But at that time, you were the Minister of Justice.
Yes.
Those were anecdotal experiences.
Yes.
They weren't coming from the broad sway of a government department. So surely you need, as a minister, to be able to take decisions, the information from departments rather than the information that you're necessarily gathering yourselves.
Well, as I said, I believe that we lacked that expert opinion when it came to being able to measure those wider societal and economic impacts, where we had a very strong level of scientific and medical evidence that was presented to us. We didn't have a chief economist, we didn't have a chief social scientist, we didn't have a chief families. And part of the difficulty, if I may say, is that there is no single department that advocates for families or for individuals. There is no single department that holds that brief. So it was relevant to my brief in terms of the impact it may have in terms of children at risk of offending, in terms of the impact it may have on prisoner rehabilitation, in terms of the impact that it may have on the vulnerabilities that we know may expose people in later life to the justice system in a negative context. So I felt it was appropriate for me to raise those issues, but I didn't have access to the level of expertise of a chief medical officer or chief scientific advisor to be able to do so in the way that you suggest.
Yes. And actually that is a gap in the ability of you as a... Because just that point 37B there, population health and inequalities are expected to be significantly affected, with the greatest effects felt by the most disadvantaged. Does that give you any practical benefit about what the actual impact of those restrictions that you were considering at that point in time were? Or is that actually falling quite a long way short of what you need in order to take a decision?
Well, I think we understood that those who were most disadvantaged in society, that the impact of that would be compounded by both lockdown and also at times how restrictions were lifted. But it didn't give us the level of quantitative data that would allow us to factor that and weigh it directly against, for example, the impact of decisions on case numbers for COVID.
But isn't that exactly what you need in order to be able to balance the health matters with the societal impact?
I think in the early stages of the pandemic, the focus was very much on how we would prevent the spread of COVID and save lives. And so in that context, and not knowing at the outset how long this may continue, our focus was more on how we would mitigate those impacts on wider society, rather than whether or not they were in and of themselves a reason not to proceed with some of the measures that were recommended.
Do you think that the Government of Northern Ireland truly understood the Section 75 equality duty or broader equality matters, and it took all steps during the pandemic to minimise the risk on those who are most disadvantaged by the restrictions that were imposed?
I think that there is, first of all, considerable sensitivity to Section 75 categories. Could we have done better in terms of factoring that into decision making? Yes, I think we could. As a department, every paper that comes to me will be screened for equality issues, human rights impacts, and I worked on the presumption that that was also the case for every paper or every set of recommendations that were being provided to other ministers. I wouldn't be cited on that internal advice.
Because you need that as a minister when you're considering matters that have been brought to the executive, which therefore are significant, cross-cutting or controversial. You need to know that the other departments have conducted that exercise properly. Is that right?
Yes.
And
It's also fair to say that if you look to the mitigations that we put in place, that it would be unfair to characterise the executive's approach as being completely unaware of the impacts. So there was considerable discussion about the impact on early years. There was extensive discussion around isolation and the impacts on mental health. There was a significant body of work done to support people who may come from more disadvantaged backgrounds. For example, the extension of free school meals over summer time and during the pandemic so that people would still receive payments for food during that period. So whilst I would concur that the evidence could have been stronger, I would take issue with the suggestion, if that suggestion is being made, that the executive was in some way insensitive to those issues, because I think the record would show that we tried to ameliorate the damage in as best we could. Would we have been aided by more clarity? Yes, I think we would have.
taking a step away from that topic.
Just before we move on, I would like to say one other thing. One of the strengths of the pandemic handling in Northern Ireland was our engagement with the unions, with the community and voluntary sector, and with community-based organisations who were very proactive in terms of their engagement. And they provided an insight as well as support to the executive around the challenges that we were facing and around potential mitigations. And engaging, for example, with the community and voluntary sector led to myself and Minister Mallon putting in place free public transport for those who were fleeing from domestic abuse and violence. And there were a number of other similar mitigations through that time. So it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge that the community and voluntary sector and the kind of wider unions and so on actually played a huge role in informing the decisions of the executive and in implementing many of the mitigations.
Do you think that the community and voluntary sector would consider that actually the government of Northern Ireland paid sufficient attention to inequalities during the course of the pandemic?
I think it would depend very much on which sectors one looks at, but I suspect in broad terms, no. I think a lot of reliance was placed on the community and voluntary sector. I think they stepped up in terms of both offering advice and assistance, of being flexible in the way they delivered their services. But they were also facing a crisis because many of the community and voluntary sector organisations rely, for example, on fundraising that was impossible during that COVID period. And so we tried to put in mitigations for charities and other groups. But it was quite late, I think, in coming, and they struggled. So I think it would be a mixed message at best.
Because it wasn't for the community and voluntary sector, it wasn't an obligation on them to step up. They chose to.
They did. And the community generally opted to step up.
And they stepped up into a gap, would you agree, that was probably left by what more could have been done by the government?
No, I genuinely think that many of those gaps pre-existed COVID. That's the first thing to say. We already work in partnership with the community and voluntary sector in Northern Ireland. This is not about knitting circles and baking scones, albeit that that's very, very valid and worthy activity. Our community and voluntary sector in Northern Ireland are incredibly skilled individuals. Many of the services, for example, within the Department of Justice that we provide, are serviced by the community and voluntary sector. They are outsourced to those organisations, and they provide, for example, support for victims and witnesses in court cases. They provide counselling for victims of domestic and sexual abuse. So in many ways, they were part of the service delivery landscape in Northern Ireland pre-COVID. Others stepped forward into that space during COVID, and others, I think, took on a greater share of responsibility during that period, and we were very grateful for that. But it would be, I think, unfair to say that, if you like, it was because government left things undone. They were part of that landscape of delivery of service prior to COVID and remained essential to that during COVID.
Yeah. I'm going to move away from where the balance lies between community, voluntary sector and government, and then look at care homes. You say in your statement that care homes are a priority area of concern from the outset. Is it right that the executive committee, well, I'll complete the quote. You say that whilst the executive took an active interest in the work being done by the Department of Health to protect residents and staff in care homes, the responsibility for policy and practice resided solely with the Department of Health. Ministers had no formal role in operational decision-making or monitoring of transmission within care homes or other parts of the healthcare system. If the Executive Committee had wished it to be so, then it could have considered taking decisions in relation to the care homes on the basis that that was a significant issue and would have fallen within its purview. Would that be right?
Theoretically, that would be correct. Practically, that would have, I think, been potentially impossible for us to deliver. In
Why?
that we would have been reliant, first of all, the government structure means that the accountability mechanisms are to the individual minister, and so it would be a considerable overreach for the executive to direct the individual minister's officials or to seek to influence those officials as they would bring their recommendations forward. Also, in terms of managing the health elements of the pandemic, the health minister, as with the executive more widely, on the particular health elements would have been entirely reliant on the same advice, which would have been the CMO, the CSA and the PHA.
Yes, but
so we would not have had a separate or alternative set of advices that were being provided to us, and therefore I don't think it would have been possible.
I just want to pick up on one point you said earlier on. It would have been a considerable overreach. If the executive considered that the situation was so bad in care homes during a pandemic, are you suggesting that they couldn't have considered it was significant and therefore it would fall to the executive? That wouldn't be an overreach, would it?
Well, significant in the terms of the legislation is a high bar, and similarly cross-cutting has to engage another department, and so I think that to have met that requirement would have required a degree of cooperation with the Department of Health that may not have been available. I would draw your attention, for example, to the point where the Executive COVID Task Force was first introduced and the resistance expressed on that occasion by the potential for duplication or interference in the health minister's remit at that time. So I would imagine that had executive colleagues tried to direct the health minister on issues around care homes, there would have been very similar, if not more robust, pushback. The situation,
but I just
if
wanted
I may
to say, in terms of the ECT, that was in December. Your statement's talking about from the outset.
Yes, I realise the difference in time. That the analogy that I'm drawing, or the point that I'm drawing out, is the degree to which there was resistance to that engagement on a cross-departmental level. The situation with care homes would have been analogous to my responsibilities within the prison system. So I had sole responsibility for decision making in terms of protecting those committed to my care in the prisons.
Mrs. Long, can I please bring you back onto care homes? I understand perfectly the analogy that you're drawing. I just want to talk about...
Well, it is essential because I would not have been able to make the decisions I did with the speed with which I made them had I had to bring each of those decisions to the dysfunctional executive that you exposed earlier in this conversation. So I was able to act at speed in line with the advice and guidance that I was receiving from my officials in a way that prevented a single death in the prison system in Northern Ireland, in contrast to almost every other jurisdiction. But had I had to bring that through executive and get, for example, cross-community support for every single decision, we would not have been able to act as swiftly and effectively. So I could understand the rationale for allowing ministers within their own remit to be able to act with a degree of independence. It is a fundamental part of the structure of Northern Ireland government that ministers have a degree of autonomy within their own departments, and to have breached that in a context where the executive was not functioning well, and in the early days where there were strains between ministers, I think would have been incredibly difficult.
But there may be times, well, I won't get into the hypotheticals. It's true that the executive didn't get to the point where it then tried to direct. It didn't get to the point where it considered that the significant or the cross-cutting stage had been reached, where it needed to then take a decision in relation to care homes. Is that right?
That is correct. We probed the decision-making. We asked questions. We sought more information with the intent, I think, to be able to provide constructive input. I believe that the work that I did in prisons could have had a positive impact on the handling in care homes. So, for example, when people were released from hospital directly to care homes without a step-down facility, this was an issue that was raised at executive, and there was a conversation that a step-down facility would be sought, potentially a hotel, where people would move for a period. Within prisons, we quarantined all new committals for 14 days to ensure that anyone arriving in prison did not enter the general population until such times as they were symptom-free or COVID-free. And I believe that that learning that we had, which I shared with executive, would have been useful in terms of managing the care home situation. But it was a matter for the Department of Health how they opted to implement that.
Thank you. I would just want to take another point in your statement. This is INQ, we'll have it up on screen, INQ 000 436642, and it's page 28, paragraph 123. And this is on the topic of your view of the relationship between the executive and, in this case, the health minister. So this is at the time of the meeting of the 9th of November that then ran through until the 12th of November. You set out there that the health minister maintained the advice remained unchanged, so any compromise would have to come from elsewhere. You say the CMO stated during the course of the meeting that any alternative approach would lead to additional excess deaths, which further raised the stakes. Could you expand a little bit about what you mean by the actions of the CMO raising the stakes in that meeting?
So I had tried repeatedly to seek a consensus. When the DUP made clear they would not support the health minister's recommendations as produced, the alternatives available to us were to agree a compromise or to allow all of the restrictions to fall at the end of the week. So whilst I understood the CMO was saying that anything short of what they'd recommended could lead to excess deaths, it became difficult to get people to look at a compromise when they were being told by the CMO that that compromise could lead to excess deaths. What wasn't reflected, perhaps, was that the number of excess deaths from the compromise would be less than if we agreed nothing at all, which was the point that I was trying to drive home. By telling ministers who were under extraordinary pressure, I mean, this was a low point for the executive. It was a low point for me in the executive. And to tell ministers who were, for whatever reason, struggling with these decisions, that to make these choices would lead to people dying, which we were already aware of in the most simplest terms, but to be told it by the CMO meant that other ministers who may have been willing to vote for a compromise then made clear they would not do so on the basis of that specific advice. So it went from us seeking to find a compromise that would allow us to do better than the inevitable consequence of no decision, but wasn't going to be as good as the original recommendation.
At that time, Sir David Stirling had retired about 3 months beforehand. Do you think that in the run-up to the 9th of November, in and around the meeting of the 9th of November that ran through from the 9th through to the 12th, do you think an experienced head of the civil service with the ability to deploy soft power, as we've been hearing, do you think that would have helped matters in and around the 9th of November?
I'm not sure, because I think people had become very entrenched. They had taken public positions, the point I made earlier. If we go into executive having established a public position, there is then very little room for manoeuvre at the executive table. So people had taken very public positions, became very entrenched, and I'm not sure that all the soft power in the world was really going to move things.
But this was a slow burn situation. If people had been taking public positions, the rates had been building, it was reaching almost a crescendo.
Yes.
And so maybe at an earlier stage, there would have been a benefit.
Perhaps, as I say, I can't deny that that might have been the case, but the trajectory and the tone of the meetings by this point had shifted significantly. People were very determined to hold to a position. Not all people. I, on this occasion, worked very closely with executive colleagues, particularly with Minister Dodds. I presented a paper to her and asked if she would table it, because if I tabled it, I knew the DUP would dismiss it. But if their colleague tabled it, they may consider it. And she did so. I then withdrew my paper, which was the fallback position, so hers was slightly tweaked. I withdrew my paper to allow hers to be taken first, in the hope that that would get us to consensus. So would a civil servant perhaps have been doing that tic-tac in the background? Potentially. But my experience, bluntly, was that at the times where we had strong leadership in the civil service, myself and Minister Mallon, both of whom bent over backwards to try to find consensus, were actually excluded from the conversation. So it's hard, given that experience, for me to see that it would have led to better outcomes.
Going to move to a completely different topic, and this is part of your responsibility as the Justice Minister. And my lady, this is a topic that might be of some sensitivity. Just hope to avoid upsetting anyone, but just want people to be aware. It's about the management of the deceased. That was a topic that fell within the Department of Justice's remit. And one aspect was about responsibility for planning and delivering a facility for the management. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And again, I don't want to be insensitive, but matters about the management of the bodies of the deceased was actually part of the Department of Health's responsibility, not the Justice Department. Is that correct? That
is correct, although it would be fair to say that the systems that were put in place at what became known as the Northern Ireland Temporary Resting Place, in the end were managed by PSNI officers who had experience of large-scale death management in crisis situations.
I just want to talk about the planning that gets us to that point. That became known as Project Dignity.
Yes.
I'm right. The inquiry's seen on a number of occasions a table of non-health sectoral reforms. I'm not going to take anybody to that, but there's no reference on that table on the 13th of March to the management of excess deaths or project dignity in the Department of Justice section of that table. Had planning commenced on that by the 13th of March 2020, to your knowledge?
Yes.
And how far advanced was that planning?
At that stage, we knew, first of all, we had identified the sectoral weaknesses. So within Northern Ireland, there was only one crematorium. It was operated by 7 members of staff, but I think only 1 or 2 of them were able to actually operate the crematorium itself. So we knew there was a vulnerability. We had also been liaising with the Department of Health about the reasonable worst case scenario and what that might look like in terms of the system becoming overwhelmed and the degree of storage capacity that would be required in any resting place facility. We were very conscious of some of the images that had been broadcast both in China and in Italy of bodies being put into mass graves, of bodies being laid outside hospitals in piles. And we didn't want to run the risk of any family in Northern Ireland having to deal with that situation. At the time when it would have been February when I was first briefed on this, by March we were seeking to establish a location for this, which was ultimately a section of Kinniger Army Barracks.
Did that in itself cause difficulties?
No, it didn't. It caused sensitivities which had to be carefully managed, but there was no objection to the site within the executive. So we had a very constructive relationship with the MOD and with the 30th Irish head of service here. They offered us a site which was secluded, not visible from main roads, so it would offer a degree of privacy and dignity to families. They also offered us a portion of ground which was not, which had no military trappings, because that would be a sensitivity for some parts of our community in Northern Ireland. And I was able to reassure executive colleagues when we sought the MACA, the Military Assistance for Civil Authority arrangement, that that would be the case, and that families arriving, bereaved families arriving, would have dignity, that there would be space for them to be able to have religious counselling, other counselling and support, and also to be able to spend time with the deceased, but that there would be no trappings around the building that would cause people any discomfort. And we spent some time thinking that through and ensuring that there were no objections. So I had no difficulty from executive colleagues in terms of any objections to that. And we were very conscious of the sensitivities of it and took that into account in any of the conversations.
Can I just ask then, given all that planning that had taken place about the sensitivities, what consideration was given when the regulations came in on the 28th of March 2020, before they were made, to ensuring that there was maintenance of that dignity and respect in terms of funerals, the ability to visit grave sites? And if there wasn't such consideration, should such consideration have been given?
There was considerable consideration given to that. So one of the first things that obviously we were not responsible for the management of graveyards. So graveyards were managed by either churches where they were part of the church estate, or by local councils. And we liaised with local councils around some of these issues. The issue of graveyards was incredibly sensitive, and I just want to reflect, if I may, on that, because it's something that I was sensitive with.
Could I just make sure that we're talking about the same time period? I'm focusing on
Yes.
prior to the regulations being made rather than any amendments afterwards.
No, I mean, it was something that we were conscious of, so things like the necessity of PPE, the need for grief and bereavement issues were things that were considered, but would not all have been the responsibility of the Department of Justice. Our responsibility was the management of excess deaths and the contingency arrangement, so it was a very specific responsibility, and we did consider issues around dignity and burial. I raised the issue, for example, of how we would communicate in Northern Ireland, where first of all burials usually happen very swiftly within 2 to 3 days. That was going to shift dramatically and people's expectations would change. For example, it would be quite abnormal in Northern Ireland for people to return to work between the death of a relative and their funeral. That would not be the case in other parts of the UK. Also, the rituals around death are quite different here. So, for example, it is typical for people to have a wake for the dead, where family, friends, colleagues will come to the house and spend time with the family. And that was not going to be possible. So we tried to communicate that, and I made a statement to the Assembly around the sensitivities of this quite early in the pandemic to set out my concerns.
Well, let me try and wrap this up
Okay.
with one final question. For you as a minister, rather than the Department of Justice as
Yes.
a consideration as a whole, do you think that that the regulations were properly drawn as of the 28th of March 2020 and took into account sufficiently all of those factors that you set out about the specific circumstances of funerals and deaths in Northern Ireland?
It's very difficult to say because I have the benefit of hindsight, and that's an advantage I didn't have at the time. Graveyards were not the peaceful, tranquil places that we know them as today. At that stage, we had, for example, large numbers of graves that had been opened in advance in case the death toll would rise and those graves needed to be available. So there were diggers and heavy machinery in graveyards digging graves. People were not sure whether COVID would be spread by the bodies themselves. And therefore, we had people in full PPE presiding over funerals and over burials. And that in itself was an incredibly stressful and distressing experience. Do I understand the sensitivity of asking people to abandon the normal rites, the normal processes around grief and loss? Absolutely. Was there an obvious and better way at that point in time? And in light of what we knew, I'm not sure. And I'll give an example where this became a tension because it perhaps explains where we were coming from. We reached a point where there were only a small number of people allowed at the graveside. And then we talked about opening graveyards up for individuals to come to visit graves. At the same time, a conversation was being had in the executive about enforcement and how we needed to step that up. And one of the points that I made was, how do you distinguish between the small number at the graveside and other individuals who are attending neighbouring graves in the, or who are part of a larger group from that family but standing at some distance? And did it matter? Was the other question that I raised. Was it a risk for people to be 5 metres apart but closer to the grave? In the case of the crematorium, it did matter that people were not able to enter the crematorium because we were trying to protect the staff. In terms of the graveyards themselves, I think less so. But again, we were being strongly advised that if we were to open up those flexibilities, that they would lead to other unforeseen consequences in terms of other open spaces, gatherings. When people go to the grave, they congregate at the tap when they're filling their vase with water for flowers. They talk, they do all the things that we'd been saying people shouldn't be doing. And so it was an incredibly difficult decision. Both my parents died in March, so it was at the start of the pandemic, and I wasn't able to attend their graves to remember, and that is difficult. That is difficult. So I appreciate that it was a lot to ask, and with the benefit of hindsight, I don't know how much of a contribution it would have made to protecting people from COVID, but we didn't have that benefit of hindsight.
Thank you, Mrs. Long. I know you have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. It's Mr. Wilcock.
Mrs. Long, I ask you questions on behalf of the Northern Ireland COVID bereaved families for justice. On the topic you've just been discussing, and I don't want to dwell on it any longer than I have to because it is very upsetting for you and everyone else, I'm just not clear. You'd explained how your specific responsibility within the department was for the delivering a facility for the management of excess deaths and contingency planning, and how there were other bodies such as the PSNI, graveyards and churches involved. In relation to the specific upsetting topics that you've talked about the use of PPE and sealed body bags, etc., was that a decision made by the Department of Justice for the reasons you've outlined, or was it a decision made by someone else for the reasons you've outlined?
It was a decision informed by the Department of Health, and so we worked with the Public Health Agency and others, and there was a concern that bodily fluids and skin-to-skin touch could contribute to COVID spread, and therefore to protect those who were involved in the funeral and death management processes, they were issued with PPE. There was also an additional layer in that councils had a duty to protect their staff, and therefore were looking as to how they could protect their staff from any potential infection, because obviously the worst outcome that we could envisage was that we would have large numbers of grave diggers, or indeed the people who operated the crematorium, ill with COVID and unable to actually deliver a timely a burial or interment.
Thank you very much. Can I move to a different topic? Could we have, please, on screen INQ 000409337, please? And this is a letter you wrote to all your executive colleagues on the 13th of March 2020. And if we look in the second paragraph very quickly, we can see that you spoke of the difficulties you told us about this morning, the obvious difficulties to anyone who lives here, caused by any divergence between the UK and the Republic of Ireland, all right? But in the next paragraph, you go on to say that the danger with such confusion, referring to what I've just been talking about, or perceived conflict between ministers and the advice of the Chief Medical Officer, is that people may ignore the core advice of the CMO and the risk of transmission will actually increase. A united, joined-up executive response is, in my view, most likely to reassure the public and affect compliance with any measures being introduced. This is what you were writing as early as the 13th of March, but that joined-up executive response should have been obviously fundamental to anyone in government, shouldn't it?
I believe so, but as we've reflected, this happened during a week. Well, first of all, it happened during a week when I had been diagnosed with COVID. So on the 10th, I was not at the executive meeting that took place. By the 13th, via the media, I had picked up on the fact that there had been various ministers, particularly the Deputy First Minister then, briefing that we should close schools immediately. My concern...
Mr. Long, may I interrupt you for time purposes only? I'm not criticising you writing the letter, and we've been over the issues that happened on the 12th. I was really asking you that by way of introduction to my next question.
Well, could I
yes,
make one point?
Yes, of course you can if you want to. But
both SAGE and the World Health Organization stressed that coherent messaging, cohesion around what we were doing, but also not just taking decisions that were clear, but explaining those decisions to the public was critical in terms of people being willing to comply. And I think that this was my concern, that we were not in that space.
Absolutely. Understood. And would you agree, however, that the confusion or the perceived conflict within the executive is, as you've described in this letter, in spite of the warnings in the letter, too often on display in the executive's public response to the public health emergency?
Yes.
And you also agree that, as well as making it, quote, to use your words in the letter, very hard for normal people to work out if they were abiding by the rules, which rules they were abiding by, this inconsistent messaging increasingly fueled the political tension and disagreement you've told us about this morning, and hindered the implementation and enforcement of restrictions, thereby creating a negative impact, again, on public trust and confidence?
I think in the immediate aftermath of my letter, we went through a period where things improved somewhat. So I think as the restrictions were implemented, there was more cohesion around the executive. The First and Deputy First Minister were making joint press conferences and so on. I think with the Bobby Story funeral and others, that was lost. And I think it was never fully regained. I think tensions increased quite significantly as we moved out of the restrictions in terms of how we would do that. And some ministers took those tensions public and made it very difficult for the public to have, I think, full confidence in the executive, in that different ministers seemed to take a very different approach and yet claimed it was based on the same advice.
And one of the reasons, you mentioned Mr. Story's funeral, one of the reasons that led to the loss of public confidence was because the joint press conferences that had worked before were stopped for a period of time thereafter.
I think those joint press conferences were very powerful, given what we've talked about in terms of the divisions between parties. That sense of unity of purpose was quite important in terms of maintaining public adherence. I also think that it undermined people's confidence at another more fundamental level, in that if the people who were making the rules did not themselves adhere to the rules, it raised the question as to whether or not they truly believed what they were trying to achieve. And I think that undermined the sense of exceptionalism. And Bobby Story funeral is one example, very clear local example, but there were lots of other public examples of politicians who appeared to say one thing and do another. And I think over a period of time that eroded public confidence in their politicians, but actually also in the advice and the guidance and the regulations themselves.
I think it's right, isn't it, that in the immediate aftermath of the funeral, the public statements of the Deputy First Minister rejected any criticism of her action, and didn't actually, until the 9th of September, publicly express regret that the public health message had been undermined in the way you've described. Is that right?
That is correct. It also created significant tension within the executive. Minister Poots lost his father during COVID, and only 6 members of his family were able to attend the grave. His father had been a long-standing political representative and would otherwise probably have had a considerable funeral. And I think at a personal level, Edwin openly expressed the distress and the hurt and pain it had caused him and his family, and that was replicated right throughout the community. One of my constituents was the family who immediately preceded at the crematorium Bobby Story's cremation, and they had to leave. They had to turn at the gate and watch the hearse drive away with their loved one inside and go home, for the next cremation to have people present on the grounds of the graveyard was incredibly distressing for them, and that was, as I say, multiplied right across the community.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Long.
Thank you, Mr. Wilcock. Thank you very much indeed for your help.
Thank you.
Mrs. Long. I'm very grateful. I think there may be some people who ought to think about getting some support during the break, so I shall take a slightly longer break, and I shall return at 20 to 12.
All rise.
Mr. Scott.
Milady, may we call Edwin Poots?
I do solemnly,
Sincerely and truly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting too long.
Not at all. Do I sit or stand, by the way?
No, I was just checking the timings. Would you please provide your full name?
Edwin Cecil Poots.
And thank you, Mr. Poots. Thank you for the assistance you provided to the inquiry. In terms of assisting the stenographer, can I ask you to keep your voice up and speak relatively slowly so the stenographer can keep track of us? You provided a witness statement dated the 6th of March 2024. That's there on the screen. And your signature and statement of truth is at page 40. Can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true?
Yes.
And are you content to rely on that as evidence in the inquiry?
Yes.
If I could just summarise your political career first, please, Mr. Poots. As far as is relevant to the inquiry, you were first elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly in 1998, and most recently were elected as the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly on the 3rd of February 2024. You've held a number of ministerial positions during your career, including Minister of Culture, Arts and Leisure from 2007 to 2008, Minister for the Environment between 2009 and 2011, and Minister of the Department of Health, Social Services and Public Safety. It says in your statement from 2010, but that should be from 2011.
11 to 14.
Yes. And in terms of the period that this module of the inquiry is considering, you were the Minister of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs from January 2020 to October 2022, although there was a temporary break for personal reasons between the 2nd of February 2021 and the 8th of March 2021.
Correct.
And you were also leader of the Democratic Unionist Party in May and June 2021.
Yeah.
I want to start, please, with your view, given your background as being a health minister from 2011 to 2014, of why you believe, as you set out in your statement, the health service in Northern Ireland was in a greatly undermined state prior to 2020.
Whenever I took over the role of health minister, I think everybody who takes over the role of health minister, it's a difficult time. And we took over at a difficult time and faced many challenges, but within those challenges we also had many success stories. And for example, we created the first north-south facility for cancer care at Alton-the-Gelvin. We introduced bowel screening for cancer. We introduced new equipment to the cancer centre at Belfast City Hospital. And amongst a series of all the things, I was providing cochlear implants for children for the first time, diabetic pumps and so forth. So there was a course of work that we achieved over that period of time which made a real life-changing differences. We also managed to maintain waiting lists at a considerably lower level than they are now. So whenever I left office in September 2014, the figures are dramatically lower than they are today. Over the intervening period, Michelle O'Neill became Health Minister in 2016 and stood down from that I think it was 8 months later, whenever Martin McGuinness resigned. And over that 3 years, the period of deterioration that took place under the civil service was quite incredible.
Just to clarify then, at that point in those 3 years, there was no health minister in place?
There was no health minister in place. And if you look at the statistics for waiting times in particular, they rose rapidly. So the health service was already in a compromised state because of a lack of leadership and decision making.
And just want to ask you, you set out in your statement, I wasn't proposing to put it on screen, but I can if you wish, your personal experiences of loss and as a healthcare during the course of the pandemic. Did those personal experiences impact upon the way you perceived the response to the pandemic?
Very much so. And, I went through that personal experience of my father becoming unwell, calling the ambulance, having him taken to hospital, and the ambulance was all geared up with all of their equipment and so forth. And we followed the ambulance down to the Ulster Hospital, and my father went in on the trolley.
I should just say, Mr. Poots, I don't want you to say anything that you don't.
No,
want to
it's
say. I don't
okay.
want too much personal detail.
And I wasn't allowed to see him again until he was close to dying. And that's the experience that thousands of families had. It was an awful experience, and that was imposed as a result of the Covid-19 regulations. And thousands of families across the province weren't able to be there with their loved ones whenever they needed them most.
Do you mind me asking which month that was?
That was in March, or April rather.
April 2020.
April 2020.
And so did those experiences in April 2020 impact upon the way that you perceived the effect of those regulations and restrictions and the approach to healthcare during the pandemic?
Very, very much so. And I would have seen things like banning people from going to graveyards as being wholly ineffective in terms of saving lives, but utterly cruel in terms of how they affected the relatives of the deceased, particularly recently deceased. And it's something that's important to many people to be able to go to the grave of a loved one. But we, the government, banned people from doing that, and I didn't see any benefits whatsoever in terms of the fight against COVID in doing that.
I know you're emotional, Mr. Poots. If I could just ask you just to keep your voice up a little bit to make sure it's being kept. Sorry. In terms of the regulations that were then made at the end of March 2020, did you have any input into the content of those regulations?
I was in a position, the same as everybody else, excuse me, that we were entering the unknown, and therefore I was supportive of the regulations that were being introduced, because we needed to take time to get a handle on how COVID-19 was going to affect. The wider public in Northern Ireland were observing what was going on in the rest of the world. We obviously had all of the television footage of what was going on in Italy, which was going through an awful period of time. So I was entirely supportive of the regulations as they were introduced at that time.
Do you think more should have been done to at that time, rather than in April? Do you think more should have been done to maintain access to graveyards and to maintain the ability to conduct funerals?
I think at that time it was difficult because we didn't know just how bad things were going to be. You know, as it transpired in COVID, we became aware relatively quickly that this is something which didn't severely impact the under 60-year-olds who didn't have other vulnerabilities. So I think at that early stage we needed to do what we'd done, but I think then after that we had the opportunity to consider things a bit differently and perhaps look at things differently in terms of just lockdown as being the only way forward.
Because at that stage you were, to use the term, following the science, because you didn't have much understanding personally about COVID-19, how it transmitted, any of those issues. Is that right?
Everybody was new to this. Obviously, epidemiologists have studied various transmissible diseases that have come forward previously, and they had a level of expertise that nobody else had, and we were heavily reliant upon the medical advice that we're receiving.
I don't know whether this will cause you any difficulties given your role as Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly at the moment. Do you think that there was sufficient democratic scrutiny of the regulations when they were first made on the 28th of March and then subsequently?
I think the fact that the Assembly at the early point gave the go-ahead for the Health Minister to make regulations and then scrutinise them afterwards didn't give the democratic scrutiny, because the decision was already made and therefore the regulations were coming weeks after the decision to implement them was carried out. So I think that the democratic scrutiny function was deficient.
Do you think that there might have been an alternative route to democratic scrutiny? Because you were a power-sharing arrangement of 5 parties. You represent, I think it's some statistic, about 98% or something of the entire population of Northern Ireland. Do you think that there was maybe an element of democratic scrutiny that way, even though it hadn't been through the Assembly?
Well, in a sense there is, but essentially the role of the executive and the role of the legislature should always be separated, and it's the role of the legislature to test the executive in terms of their decision making, and that's something that I've always cherished, even as a minister, that people have challenged me about my decisions. And I think that's important, that role that the Assembly member or parliamentarian has, representing the constituents that they serve, to seek to ensure that the executive are carrying out their role in an appropriate manner.
In terms of limits of power, you say in your statement that the power vested in the Department of Health Minister, CMO and CSA was quite incredible. They needed neither the executive nor the Assembly to introduce punitive regulations without recourse to others. As the executive, surely those decisions were a matter for you rather than a matter for the Department for Health taken individually.
Not as the Assembly give the authority to the Department of Health. So de facto, the Health Minister brought everything to the executive, but the jury didn't have to.
Why do you think he did that?
Well, it gave him political cover for very difficult decisions, and in most instances he got through what he was wishing to get through. Well, I'm sure we'll come on to later some of those decisions being challenged, but in most instances he got what he was wishing to do without doing solo runs on it, so it made sense for him to do it that way.
Well, surely it was the best thing to do, to bring it to the executive for the executive's consideration.
Absolutely, but he didn't have to. He did, but he didn't have to, is what I'm saying.
One of the other points that you make is on a regular basis, media ran proposals in advance of the Executive Committee which built a momentum for that proposal. Could you expand a little bit about what you mean about that, please?
It was quite evident that the media were receiving leaks in advance of decisions being made, and the leaks were being presented in such a way that it was driving towards a particular direction for a decision to be made, and it was widely viewed that those leaks were coming not from the Minister but from within the Department of Health.
Why did you believe that?
Because the nature of what was coming out, no other department would have had that level of information.
And what difficulties did that pose the Executive Committee at that time?
It's not so much the difficulties. I just think that it would have been better had the facts been brought to the executive first, as opposed to there being a public debate in advance of the executive. And the public debates were very often framed by the media in the way that they wanted to do it.
Is there a negative impact of a public debate between two ministers before a decision has been taken on the topic that they may be discussing?
In my view, yes.
And what would that negative impact be?
I think that whenever you come to the executive to make decisions, you should come with a clean slate. I disagree with a civil servant who says you shouldn't take your constituents' views into consideration in those circumstances, because we're there to represent constituents. We are public representatives. Our role is to represent the views of the public that we serve. The civil servants rule are public servants. Their job is to carry out what the public want them to carry out, and therefore to suggest that we should ignore what constituents want whenever it comes to executive decisions is something which I think the civil service have lost the run on themselves, if that's what they think.
In terms of your ministerial constituency, is it right that you effectively have two? You have your constituency that elected you as an MLA, and then you have the entire population of Northern Ireland
Yeah.
is interested. You have to act in the best
Correct.
interest. One of the other aspects that you touch upon in your statement is, please let me get the reference. You say that, and this is in relation to the Department of Health coverage, that getting executive buy-in was not necessary but gave the Health Minister political cover. Very often it was the First Minister, Deputy First Minister who broke the bad news to the public of more restrictions. When there was more positive news, DOH put it out themselves. Did you think that there was a breakdown between the Department of Health and, say, the First Minister and Deputy First Minister about how public messaging and such issues were managed?
I don't think there was, but it was noteworthy that whenever I had an executive decision that was introducing more restrictions and more punitive things, it was always the First and Deputy First Minister who fronted that up. But when there was more positive news coming out of the Department of Health, the Minister may have utilised his own resources to get that information out.
Did that lead to a breakdown in relationships between the ministers?
Not that I'm aware of.
Well, we've heard some evidence from Jenny Piper in relation to the setup of the Executive COVID Task Force in December 2020, that was at the instigation of the First and Deputy First Minister,
Yeah.
in terms of trying to have a little bit more control, my terminology, over what was coming out of the Department for Health. Was that your understanding of the reasons for the ECT being set up at that time?
Well, I certainly heard that, and I also know that the Department of Health were a bit resistant to that being established, but also the Department for Economy weren't wild keen about it either. So I think it was the Executive Office wanting to have a bit more control of the situation than perhaps they would otherwise. The remarkable thing about the way the administration is established is that the ministers with the least power, in a sense, is the First and Deputy First Minister, because their areas of service is quite limited. They chair the executive meetings. They have they allow the agenda and so forth. So they have power in that sense. But when it comes to day-to-day decision making, the rest of the ministers have far more opportunities to do things than the First and Deputy First Minister.
Do you think that would also apply equally to the head of the civil service, for example, not having the power to direct other permanent secretaries to allocate resources?
That is also the case. The head of the civil service wouldn't have the same power as their equivalent at Westminster, for example.
And is that, I'm not making a value judgment, is that a potentially negative effect of the way that power sharing structures are designed and how they operate in a national health emergency, as opposed to when you're not in that setting, when they're performing their more normal roles?
The truth is that the structures that we have are not the most ideal structures, but they're structures that were established after 25 years of bloodshed. And, they are the structures that are necessary to ensure that we've had a peaceful 27 or 8 years since that.
But work can always be done in order to make sure that relationships are built. Do you think that more work could have been done between the departments to make sure that they were working together more collegiately or more effectively?
I suppose in everything, whenever the decisions are simple, it's easy to work together. Whenever the decisions are more complicated and difficult, then people will tend to have their independent views. We obviously had some very challenging decisions to make. And just say this about Northern Ireland, we're a population of 1.9 million people, and we are much closer to the wider public than a Westminster government. So the public had a lot of direct access to me as a minister than they ever would have in, for example, a Secretary of State who'd be making decisions in the Cabinet. And that does have a bearing, because whenever you're getting lots of phone calls from people about a whole range of issues, that would never happen with a member of the Cabinet, because that access just wouldn't be available to them. And it is a consideration in how we do our business, is that we just, we're just much more available and approachable to the wider public.
That takes me neatly on to another topic in terms of access to information. I think this morning described what you were discussing there as anecdotal evidence that ministers take in from constituents. That's not meant to diminish it, it's just putting a different term on it. Do you think that you, as a minister dealing with a public health matter which was not within the central remit of your department, is that fair to say?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that you had sufficient information of the wider societal and economic impacts of the restrictions that were imposed in response to the pandemic?
I think in terms of the information coming from the executive, probably not. This was a health crisis, and it was led by the Department of Health, and their focus was Covid-19, and it was Covid-19 to the exclusion even of other health matters. So, for example, over that period of time, there was over 25,000 breast screenings, cancer breast screenings cancelled, nearly 94,000 bowel cancer screenings cancelled.
Mr. Poots, can I just say, there is a subsequent module which will deal with healthcare.
Sure.
So I don't necessarily want to blur lines too much.
No, that's fair enough.
But in relation to particularly social impact,
Yeah.
do you think that you received enough information about, for example, older people or disabled people, or the impact upon young people?
Whenever the executive first sat, and that was in January 2020, they had decided that one of their priorities was going to be mental health. That, for example, was entirely obliterated and ignored throughout this crisis. We didn't take into account so many other things, and this was something which was raised by myself and others on a regular basis. The issues about domestic abuse, alcohol abuse, alcoholism rose significantly. Young people and their mental health, and so many other societal issues, but the focus was almost entirely on our response to COVID-19, to the complete ignorance of everything else.
Is that the focus that was driven by the Department of Health?
Yes.
And do you think they got the balance wrong?
Yes.
And do you think that there was more that you could have done as a minister to refocus that balance?
I think that I raise these issues on a very regular basis, and I had no other mechanism to alter that.
You say in your statement that, and I'll paraphrase slightly, please tell me if I've mischaracterised it, that as your understanding of the science improved, that you challenged the scientific advice that you were being provided by the CMO and the CSA to a greater extent. Does that reflect a change in approach from yourself from, say, March 2020 through to the summer and then the autumn of 2020?
Absolutely.
Because would you please describe what you believe should have happened you can go back to February or January 2020, should you wish, in terms of the executive's response to the growing pandemic?
I think the initial response was the right response. I think if anything, the lockdown should have happened more quickly. So we were largely waiting on what was happening with Her Majesty's government.
Do you think you could have moved quicker?
No,
Then?
no, we didn't. We didn't have the wherewithal to do that. So had we organised a lockdown without having the backing of the Treasury, we hadn't the financial capability to see that through. So we had to wait to Her Majesty's government moved. And, you know, frankly, I think it was appalling that Cheltenham and all of those things were allowed to happen in advance of the lockdown happening. Northern Ireland was slightly better off in that we were probably about 2 weeks behind the rest of the UK. London, obviously, as a hub, particularly the Heathrow, was always going to have things a lot quicker than the outliers as we would be in Northern Ireland.
So at what point do you think Northern Ireland should have entered into a lockdown if you believed it should have been earlier?
It probably wasn't going to be many weeks earlier, but certainly it probably could have been done the previous week.
Okay. Did you push for an earlier lockdown?
No, because we didn't have the capability to carry that through.
Did you seek to improve the capabilities in order to be able to carry out what you believe should have been carried out?
Well, our First and Deputy First Minister and the Finance Minister, you know, were engaging at that level with Westminster in terms of what steps needed to be taken, because we all knew that a lockdown was coming. But certainly in my role as Dairy Minister, my work was preparing that department for what was coming our way. And Northern Ireland is accountable for over 10% of the United Kingdom's food production. United Kingdom is around 2/3 self-sufficient in food. And moving into pandemic, it was absolutely critical that local food supply would continue, because you don't know what's going to happen in the rest of the world. So my focus was very much on ensuring that we were able to maintain a food chain. We're supplying around 20% of the UK's chicken, well into the teens in pork, around over 10% in milk and beef. So, you know, our role in providing food for all of the people of the United Kingdom is a very critical role, and that was where my focus was on.
I'm going to come back to some of those points, just deal very briefly with the food chain. Was there ever a cliff edge moment in terms of whether the food chain might have broken down between Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
There was a number of areas we were seriously concerned. First of all, of our ability to keep factories open, because factories were a place where if this pandemic, if this COVID-19 could spread asymptomatically, you know, people are working pretty close together. There's a lot of water being spread and so forth. So there was a great opportunity for spread in those factories. So that was a really big concern. Second thing that we had a real significant issue with was in the ferries, because it wasn't paying the ferries to keep operating. So there had to be financial support for the ferries to be able to continue to move goods.
And where did that financial support come from?
In the Treasury. And that was negotiated by the Department for Infrastructure.
Just want to then come back a stage. I was asking you earlier on about you have a couple of different constituencies. You have your local constituency, you have for the entire population of Northern Ireland. You also have your departmental role as you're identifying there. But they're not mutually exclusive. You may have been preparing for aspects within DAERA, but also if you did have that level of concern about the potential impact upon Northern Ireland as a whole, do you think you should have been pushing harder about what needed to be done at an early stage in March 2020?
Essentially, we all have a collective responsibility. I don't think we as a Northern Ireland executive could have moved ahead of the decision at Westminster. So we were waiting on the Johnson government to move. But, you know, most of us were wanting to move quickly. And of course, we did respond immediately whenever that did happen.
Just want to deal with some of the points that you make about moving earlier on. And if we can have INQ 000 426 982, this is your statement, Mr. Poots, page 25, paragraph 102. And it's important to use your words rather than my words. We're going to highlight paragraph 102. Thank you very much. So, the point that I'm focusing on there is the fourth line up from the bottom, where you say, it transpired the greatest super spreader of Covid-19 was in fact the Department of Health with devastating consequences. Mm-hmm. Could you please expand upon what you mean by that?
I think that the Department of Health followed the Department of Health in England and took the decision that we needed to have hospital beds ready for potentially an awful lot of people coming in. And in order to do that, we needed to empty the hospital. As former Minister of Health, I recognise that hospital is one of the most dangerous places you can be in terms of every infection is within a hospital, so the sooner you can get out of a hospital, the better in normal circumstances, but that's the home. In this instance, if COVID was going to be around, it was going to spread within a hospital environment. It's warm, there's lots of people moving about and all of that. And the fact that a lot of elderly people had COVID-19 in hospital should have come as no surprise to anyone. And therefore, to move people directly from hospital to residential care or to nursing care homes without having any form of quarantine or any form of testing, in my view, was a reckless act.
You said earlier on that you believe the Department for Health Northern Ireland was following Department of Health and Social Care in Westminster. Are you critical of the Department of Health in Northern Ireland for following Westminster's approach on this topic?
Yes, I am.
Why?
Because the evidence is there for everybody to see, and I know you can say, well, you have the benefit of hindsight, and we do, but a little foresight involved would have said we should not be putting people from hospitals into a care facility where there's other vulnerable elderly people without having some form of quarantine in place and ensuring that there's a separation between the people coming out of hospital into care, or indeed that these people have been tested, which they weren't.
I just want to focus a little bit about following the advice as opposed to the output. Northern Ireland doesn't have anywhere near the same level of scientific advice on a kind of governmental scale that the United Kingdom does. So would it, with the knowledge that you have now about SAGE and other structures, do you think it was realistically possible in March 2020 for the scientific advisors within the Department of Health to take a different view to that was being advanced by SAGE or Westminster?
Yes. I think what I'm saying is common sense. And, I also have an agricultural background, and what I learned from my earliest days is prevention is better than cure. And in this instance, you would never put someone with pneumonia in with a sick patient, because pneumonia spreads. Any of these diseases that can spread, by air, you would never actually mix people like that. But the Department of Health took that decision to do that, and they done it on the basis of they're going to need all of this bed space. Now, I indicated about my father being in hospital in April. Whenever we were allowed in at the very last, the hospital had very few people in it. So the urgency that was created to get all of these elderly people out of hospital and have these beds available, that didn't materialise. But what did materialise was that the nursing homes were left in an absolutely perilous state. Now, my daughter was a student at the time, and she worked in the nursing homes, and it was just awful, absolutely awful. Whenever she was coming home, they were run ragged, they were wearing all of the equipment and all the gear and all of that, and it was a horrendous experience for all of those people who were working in nursing homes, and they were losing patient after patient after patient. And it was a horrific time for nursing homes and the people who were providing care within them.
If I can just bring you back to your view of the scientific advice that was being received, are you saying that it should have been clear, or it was, let me phrase it a different way, are you saying it was clear to you in March 2020 that the scientific advice should have been not to allow, well, what do you believe the scientific advice should have been at that period of time?
The scientific advice should have been that if we believe we need beds in the hospital, then we need to empty these beds in a manner which doesn't cause further issues and further problems. And therefore, the removal of those people from the beds should have been done in a much more structured way, as opposed to just divest them all to the nursing and residential homes without any form of testing and without any form of quarantine.
Is it right to say that you are not a man who struggles to put their point across, should they wish to do so?
No, I'm not.
So, were you making that view known in March 2020?
No, because it was done without me being made aware of it in the first instance. This decision was made within the Department of Health.
So this is what you say at the bottom of this paragraph: the Department of Health did not consult the Executive Committee at any point on this. Do you believe that that was a decision that should have been taken by the Executive?
It would have been much better had it been taken by the Executive, because it would allow the challenge function to be exercised.
Yes, but two slightly different matters about whether it would have been better to whether it should have been.
Well, it should have been, yes. That was a major decision which caused the deaths of many people needlessly.
Well, when you realised that that decision had been taken, did you seek to take steps to bring it to the Executive to say we need to consider this as the Executive or not?
You couldn't undo the harm that had been done. The people had already been put out into the nursing homes, and the damage had been done.
So in those early days, after the decision had been taken, you don't think it would have been possible to reverse it as an Executive Committee?
No, because the hospital beds had already been depopulated.
One of the other critical elements, or one of the other elements that you're critical of, is a failure to implement early test and trace. Just want to ask about an area that DARA was able to help with. There is the AFBI. Would you be able to explain what that is, please?
Agricultural, Food and Biosciences Institute.
And that is a scientific institute?
Yes.
And it was one that in middle of 2020 was able to provide testing.
Yes.
For COVID-19.
At my instruction.
Yes. And is the sequence right that there was a, and this is coming from the DARA corporate statement, I don't know how familiar you are with that one, that on the 18th of March 2020, AFBI received an alert that it needed to be ready to provide assistance. Mm-hmm. Do you think that alert should have been sent earlier than the 18th of March 2020?
I think the information flow that came to the Executive in the first instance was very slow in February, for example. And it was March before we were getting much information through. So immediately, at the first Executive meeting that this was discussed, I was able to indicate that AFBI had the resource to carry out scientific analysis and testing, and that other things would be stood down to make that available for the purposes of fighting COVID-19.
But in fact, testing within AFBI didn't actually commence until after the 11th of May 2020. Northern Ireland is not blessed with a vast array of resources in terms of testing laboratories, is it?
No.
So do you think in the event of a future pandemic, it would be important that all available resources, whether intentionally designed for human testing or not, should be able to be stood up quickly in order to provide as much testing as possible?
Totally agree. So I indicated that we should do this and give the instruction that we should do it, and the civil service is a remarkable machine, but it managed not to have it available until the 11th of May, but it wasn't for a lack of political will.
Well, was it an element of political chasing of your departmental officials in those nearly 2 months before?
Yes, there was.
And what was the outcome of that chasing?
We got it at the 11th of May as opposed to some later point, but there was quite a bit of chasing done, yes.
I also want to ask, and it's a point that was raised with Professor Serene Young, about the role of the DARA CSA. So DARA has its own chief scientific advisor, that's
yes.
correct? And it's actually that chief scientific advisor, rather than Professor Serene Young within the Department of Health, who's plugged into the UK-wide science network. Mm-hmm. Is that right? And what the DARA corporate statement sets out is that from early January to mid-August 2020, that the DARA CSA wasn't receiving communications from the CSA network because an incorrect email address for the DARA CSA had been used, and that actually the DARA CSA had assumed communications were not being produced by the CSA network because of the informal nature of the meetings. In terms of the process within DARA, that you can have a CSA in the middle of a pandemic who assumes that there's no contact through a countrywide CSA network for the best part of 7 months, does that not indicate there's a bit of a deficiency within the effective processes of the department?
I'll be honest, I wasn't aware that was the case, and it does indicate a deficiency. I accept that.
I want to take you to one of your WhatsApp messages. This is dated the 14th of March 2020. It's INQ 000 356 174, and it's page 8. Thank you very much. And it's the entry. Thank you very much. 1536, we say we're in this first a long haul. Likely schools will have to close, but last week was ready on the hysterical side. So that's the 14th of March. What did you mean by on the hysterical side?
There was the effort to close schools down more quickly, I suppose, than other things, and obviously at that stage there was a push to align with what was going on with the Republic of Ireland, and parents were being scared, and I think that's where that was coming from.
If we can then go to page 9, please. And it is the entry at 1801. Thank you very much. And we can see there that's from Little Pengelly. At the time, Mr. Pengelly was the special advisor for the First Minister. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then this is the 14th of March. And there's an indication about some issues that the civil contingencies could and should be doing. So information for schools. So parents with complex medical needs, dealing with self-isolating child, drawing up guidance, considering a daily briefing. To what extent did the members of the DUP who were ministers, who were all on this group chat, is that right?
Yes.
To what extent were they pressing for this to be done across the government?
That would have been led by the First Minister, and the First Minister worked extremely closely with our special advisor, and she would have been actioning that in terms of seeking to move these things forward.
Can we scroll down a little bit, please? Thank you. And again, those other 5 elements. So implementation of an update, a twice daily update, coordinating, supporting local communities, and then risk registers and update for ministers on a regular basis. Do you think that what Ms Pengelly was setting out there was actually what happened on the 14th of March, or at what point in time did any of those aspects come into play?
Well, certainly there's aspects of it come into play. Obviously, these are Ms Little Pengelly's thoughts at an early stage of how we could respond. And this is essentially thinking out loud and putting something in writing. It is for a wider group to make those decisions, and the wider group was the Executive Committee, who were also getting information from the Department of Health and they were the lead department in terms of bringing their thoughts forward as to how to do these things, is for individuals to argue for the types of things that Ms. Little-Pingelly was offering. And that again would have been led by the First Minister, who she was directly working for.
Because, for example, the coordination of local councils' third sector, we know the next executive meeting was the 16th of March. Had there been a sufficient push from the DUP in the executive to make sure that that was done?
Again, I think that question is probably best placed for the former First Minister.
I also want to talk about other steps that you were taking as DARE Minister. One of the aspects of your statement that you're very focused on is about making sure that people had access to outdoor spaces.
Yes.
And you say in your statement that you reopened country and forest parks. It was within the DARE remit in terms of the closure of those open spaces. I think they were closed from March 2020 through to the 5th of June 2020.
Yeah.
Do you believe that those car parks, public access facilities, should have been opened at an earlier stage?
I would have liked to have opened them earlier and pressed very hard for that to be the case.
Did you press very hard for that? Or, on reflection, you thought you would have liked to have pressed harder?
No, I did press very hard for it.
Because you pressed hard in terms of access to graveyards.
Yes.
But equally, the open spaces weren't open until June 2020. So there was a bit of a lag between graveyards and those open spaces.
Yes.
Again, on reflection, do you think that they should have been open at a much earlier point in order to assist the population of Northern Ireland?
I think that they could have been opened at an earlier point, and should have been opened at an earlier point. We were able to arrive at a conclusion relatively quickly that people outdoors were relatively safe. That there was concerns that, given the numbers of people who are at home, that the country parks could be overrun and potential for congregating in car parks and so forth because of those numbers. So it wasn't exactly straightforward, but it was something that we had a strong desire and push to do. And they were opened on the 5th of June. I'd like it to have happened earlier.
What prevented them opening earlier?
Some of the things I'm just after saying, we had to take into the considerations of management.
Apologies. In terms of
the numbers. So you take, for example, Castlewell and Forest Park, the period after that, the Tullymore Forest Park and places like that there, the numbers coming through those country parks was incredible. So people having been closed in their house, having the ability to do something, an awful lot of people wanted to do that. So we did have to look at the management of that, having enough staff and so forth in place. And again, whilst I would have liked it to happen quicker, it happened when it happened. Wasn't as a result of lying back.
And at that time, were you considering the scientific advice about the benefits and potential risks about opening up those open spaces?
Yes.
If I can then show you INQ 000356174, and it's page 37, and this is dated the 16th of July 2020. Thank you. That's at 1336. So this has moved slightly on in time. This is 16th of July. The COVID rates are slightly on the increase in Northern Ireland. Is that correct, as far as you remember?
Yes, slightly.
So you say there, I just don't get the sense that this is driven by the science. I presume that's meant to be. Again, what do you mean that at that point in time it's not being driven by the science?
In terms of it, and I made reference earlier to the issue about cancers and about cancer screenings, for example, being cancelled. We got into a situation where COVID became the single issue, and we didn't take into account enough of the other matters. I was indicating about the number of screenings that were cancelled in that period of time was actually runs into 160, 70,000. Over 4,000 heart screenings cancelled. Diagnosis in terms of people seeing consultants, 4,500 cases cancelled, 1,000 of them red flags. The science is that, people there's 4,600 people died of cancer in 2020, and we were closing down so many of the areas to actually ensure that we fought cancer. That in that year we had 2,000 less diagnoses. Therefore, we weren't as doing what we should have been doing as a health service, and ensuring that we were following the science, and the science was that we needed to prevent cancer, heart disease, diabetes, but we closed down all those clinics unnecessarily.
I appreciate the factors that you're taking into account. I want to talk about your decision making as it's progressed. I mean, you say that we'll have to respond probably with localised lockdown. In July 2020, was that something that you were prepared to contemplate, the idea of localised lockdowns?
Yes, because first of all, having recognised that COVID-19 was particularly virulent amongst the elderly and the vulnerable population, the view that I was establishing over the period, because it was a learning curve for everybody, and I have to say this, I think everybody was trying to do their best, grappling with something that they had little knowledge about previously, with the information that was coming forward and based on what was happening on the ground. And I don't think any single person meant harm to anybody else at either political or civil service level or anything else. So whether it was considered to be a good job or a bad job, and I think that it was a bit of both, people were doing things as they saw best. In terms of how I thought we should have been responding, was we recognised that people with vulnerabilities, people with various conditions, including obesity, were much more vulnerable to COVID-19. Our elderly people were much more vulnerable to COVID-19. So why are we locking down everybody and everything? And therefore, I did think that we should be looking at being much more strategic, perhaps, in how we responded, as opposed to a blanket approach.
You had a situation where you believed March.
Sorry, if I can just reply, because I'm just getting the context of that a wee little better. This was in relation to the masks issue, and the challenge was, are we following the science on masks? Because was there science in masks? Because at one point, Dr. McBride had came to the executive committee when people were pushing for masks and said masks don't work and masks won't provide much benefit. And then by the time we got to July, that had changed, and I hadn't heard the scientific backup for that particular change.
Because I think this can come down off the screen, thank you. You'd had March 2020 where you believed there should have been earlier responses. In summer 2020, it's fair to say that you believe that there should have been more targeted responses.
Yes.
And what do you think those targeted responses should have looked like?
First of all, I think the essential workers in themselves ensured that there was an awful lot of mixing. And whenever you looked at the range of essential workers, including people working in retail and people working in all of those food factories that I referred to earlier on, as well as your hospital workers, police, everything else, ensured that no lockdown with all of those people still mixing would ever be entirely successful in stopping the spread of the virus. Therefore, for me, the focus should have been on providing the greatest amount of protection for the cohort who were most likely to get or to to die from COVID-19, as opposed to the cohort who weren't likely to die from COVID-19.
The reason why I'm asking the questions is because your statement could be interpreted as being very critical about the actions that you believe were being driven by the Department of Health, which I believe you would accept they were following what they considered to be the best scientific course. Do you accept that?
I accept that they were following the scientific course that was being followed by United Kingdom broadly, and indeed United Kingdom was probably following what World Health Organization was recommending as well.
But in terms of your criticisms of the response, and you're saying that there should have been a different response, are you able to indicate what you believe that different response should be?
I think that we should have been encouraging people who were vulnerable. I'm saying encouraging and encourage them very strongly and informing them for their own well-being, that they should avoid contact with other people. So you cannot do that for every older person, but there was quite a lot of older people who were not being cared for, who could have had their shopping delivered, who, you know, didn't have to mix with other people, and this would have been hugely unpleasant for them. But as vulnerable people, it would have been a means of avoiding them, you know, getting the condition, which is COVID-19, which could have led to a premature death. So I believe that more work could have been done on actually ensuring that those who were more susceptible to dying from COVID-19 could have taken steps to avoid catching it. But instead, over the summertime, everybody was allowed to mix, and then that led to the spike that happened in the autumn time.
Can I press you a little further?
Yeah.
You say, and I think it's clear from the Executive Committee handwritten notes, that you were posing your view on the fact that there should have been different groups taken into account. But were you ever proposing what you considered the solutions should be, rather than identifying what the problems were?
I did, and I had a dispute with the Chief Medical Officer that, you know, instead of locking down everybody, we should be focusing on the people who are most likely to die from COVID-19 if they caught it. And he indicated that would be discriminatory against the older population. And I said, but we're discriminating against the entire population, and the younger people in particular, who are not likely to die from COVID-19 by preventing them having their education. And the consequences of preventing those young people having their education is that in the aftermath of it, absenteeism in schools went up by 123% for people who were absent from school more than 10% of the time. The consequence of that is that people who are absent more than 10% of the time, these 5 GCSEs and more, goes down from 88% to 46%. Their mental health.
Can I just ask you, Mr. Poots, just to focus on the question in terms of...
I thought it was. Apologise.
I think we may have strayed fractionally off the path. You said you had a conversation with the CMO. When did that take place, as far as you're able to remember?
It would have been in the summertime, possibly August.
And did you have a full and frank and forthright discussion amongst the Executive Committee about those views?
Yes, I remember the discussion that took place, and I remember the challenge that the focus should be on protecting the people who are going to be most vulnerable to this condition, because whenever I agreed in March and was actually looking for lockdown in March because we didn't know what was coming, by the time we got to June, July, August, we had a reasonable evidence base of how COVID-19 was affecting the wider population. And we recognised that children weren't dying from it. And that was a real fear at the very outset, you know, that we were going to lose, you know, many children. We recognised that wasn't the case. So for me, the focus should have then switched from the entirety of the population to the people who were most vulnerable to the condition which was COVID-19.
Okay.
Mr. Poots, do you think, sorry to interrupt,
Sure.
do you think taking the approach that you've just been advocating, would that have been easier in Northern Ireland, given the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland, or harder than the rest of the UK? In other words, England has a larger population, for example.
Yes. And we have a much stronger family structure in Northern Ireland as well. We're a smaller country, and it's easier to support your elderly relatives, personally. And at the outset of COVID, for example, in my own family, we dismissed the carers who were looking after my father at that stage, and our own family took over, and he didn't get COVID. But yes, I do. I think it would have been easier in Northern Ireland. But I'll say this: it wouldn't have been easy. Nothing was easy during this, and there was no easy solutions to fighting COVID-19. If there was, it would have been devised by someone much smarter than me, but there wasn't. But I did challenge that we shouldn't be locking down everybody whenever there was evidence that this wasn't affecting everybody equally. Now, I know and understand that children could carry it home to their parents, and their parents could carry it home to their grandparents, and all of those arguments. And it was for people to take steps to ensure that they mitigated that as much as possible.
At the time you had that conversation with the CMO, or subsequently, did you advance or suggest or provide a package of possible restrictions that you believed would have been appropriate? Or, again, was it you'd raise the concerns and then it was for the CMO or others to design something in response?
The second.
And when you felt that that wasn't making the headway that you sought, did you press again or not?
I think there was huge frustration, and again, that the only thing that we seemed to be relying upon was the lockdown method, and that manifested itself in later meetings. But we did press, and not me only, but we did press that we should be looking at other means of trying to ensure that we reduce the spread of COVID-19.
In terms of the scientific advice, I think you're very clear in your statement that you were challenging and probing and testing the scientific advice,
yes.
And at times you believed that you weren't getting the evidence base that you sought. But at any point, did you have what you considered to be sufficient scientific evidence that pointed against the advice that you were being given?
Well, if we go back to the masks, we had advice from the Chief Medical Officer which said no, and then we had advice from the Chief Medical Officer which said yes, but we didn't get the scientific basis for the switch in that position.
Did you get sufficient scientific evidence, as far as you were concerned, about the reason why ongoing restrictions were as they were?
Sorry?
Did you get sufficient scientific evidence about the reason why the restrictions, in terms of the impact of closing various sectors of the economy, or personal restrictions as opposed to masks?
We got considerable. The Chief Scientific Advisor gave considerable evidence, and I remember questioning the whole issue about R and how we arrived at R, and it transpired that was changing all of the time. So R wasn't one consistent piece of things that were met, and then you got your R rate. That changed over time. So I remember, for example, having considerable discussion about hairdressers, and these are people who don't have a lot of money. They're on the lower end of the pay scale, and they weren't being allowed to reopen, and the R rate was having a very negligible impact upon the R rate, but nonetheless the decision was made by the executive not to allow them to re-participate. So we were getting advice, and the advice sometimes was that
Again, just to be clear, the
the
advice
impact was very nominal, you know, on making decisions. But generally, even if when the impact was nominal or minimal, they decided not to proceed in any event.
Just for my understanding, when you say the advice there, was that from the CMO and CSA, or was that from
CSA in the main.
So, again, is it fair to summarise it that at no point did you have evidence that was contradicting what the CMO and the CSA were saying? It was just that you were taking a different view about what should be done with that advice?
Yes.
I want to move now to the meeting of the 9th of November. Was that meeting so contentious because it was a culmination of months? Sorry, I don't know whether you heard what I was saying there. Was that meeting so contentious because it was the culmination of months of rising rates and frustration about the restrictions that were in place?
That and the absence of identifying anything other than lockdowns to actually stop the spread of it.
At that time in the 9th of November, was it the intention of DUP ministers to use the cross-community vote to prevent those restrictions being extended?
They met beforehand, and it was indicated, you know, the lead was coming from the First Minister and the party leader, that should they proceed to vote on it, that we should use the veto, and that was the direction at the meeting. It was a direction that I agreed with at that point, because the First Minister had been trying over the previous number of days to find an agreed way forward, and that hadn't proven to be possible. And the Executive does largely operate on consensus, and we wanted to try to maintain that and achieve that. But we were moving to a position where majoritism was going to be the only way forward, and I think that would have been a backward step.
Were there any DUP minister who did not want to use the cross-community vote?
They didn't express that if they did.
You say in your statement,
Minister Weir seconds the proposal, so no, I don't think there was.
Because it's right, isn't it, that the suggestion of using the cross-community vote was discussed on the executive committee group of the DUP. Is that right?
Yes.
And that wouldn't have been a knee-jerk reaction. That was a decision that was taken in advance.
Correct.
And you say in paragraph 152 of your statement, using the cross-community vote as a check to bring the reality home that things cannot be driven through. When you're saying bring the reality home, were you using that vote as a marker to the other parties that you weren't prepared to accept that any further?
I think that we had, in spite of all of the ups and downs of that year, and there was mainly downs, but we had tried to work together and arrive at conclusions, and very often, you know, there was, as you look at the minutes, you'll find there was lots of breaks in those meetings where the First and Deputy First Minister met with the Health Minister and came back to the meeting sometimes within 20 or 30 minutes. Very often it took hours. But they hammered these issues out and found a way forward. But at this point, there didn't seem to be a willingness to do that. And that led to this situation. And I don't propose that this was the best way forward. But nonetheless, I think I indicated at the meeting this was an action of last resort. So it wasn't something that was just charged into lightly. It was thought about beforehand. But we were trying to get an agreed way forward as opposed to having a majority decision take place in the Executive.
Did you consider what the impact would be of using a cross-community vote on a public health measure in November 2020, what the impact would be on the broad population of Northern Ireland?
We did, yes. And the thing is, as public representatives, we tried to look at the thing as holistically as possible. So if I can give an example, my lady, we had a young lady approached us, for example, who had a seat in a hairdresser's. Because she didn't have a business address, she didn't get any financial support. And that young lady was raising 2 children on her own. And she didn't have the finances to feed her children. Now, for her, fortunately enough, her grandmother emptied her savings account to provide support for that young lady. That is an example of what was happening with thousands of people across Northern Ireland. And as a politician, we have to take these things into account as well as everything else. People do have needs out there, and consequently, we perhaps looked at the thing more broadly, perhaps, than was coming from the Department of Health, who looked at it purely from the health perspective.
Just one very niche topic to finish with, and these are the tweets that you sent on the 9th of November. You say in your statement, I sent the tweets after the 9th of November meeting out of frustration at the damaging proposals. And then you go on to say, I do not consider the tweets impacted the public's confidence in the executive. Rather, the tweets reflected the view of many in the public. Is it not actually the case that those tweets were intended by you in order to set the agenda and set the policy considerations of the population in Northern Ireland?
Well, they were an alternative viewpoint, and there was great frustration that perhaps a lot of the issues that had been raised, not just for, in the run up to the 9th of November, but for weeks and months in advance of that, perhaps hadn't been taken as seriously as they should have.
Or were they part of a communication strategy from you?
No, it wasn't a strategy. It was probably more in frustration than anything else.
Well, can I just please show INQ 000274194? I'm very close to the end, my lady.
Mm-hmm.
And we can see there, that's the first. There were 3 tweets that you sent, 101, 109 and 127. If we can just please go to the third one, that's 274196. Where we have mental health and domestic abuse rising dramatically, leading colleges to warning poor outcomes from lockdown. And that's at 127.
Yeah.
If I can take you to INQ 000356174, that's at page 55. If we scroll down to 0048, please. So that's that message at the bottom, and that's 11th of 11th, 0048. So that's sent about 13 minutes before your first tweet is sent. And you say comms is critical. We need our people on every programme setting the agenda. And then there's reference there to lead cardiologist in the Royal, and 3 other doctors are criticising it. Mental health issues are rocketing, as is domestic violence. Lowest paid workers are losing vital wages. So when you're talking there 13 minutes before you set your first tweet about communications and setting the agenda, is it not right that actually the content of that message finds its way into the tweets that you sent between 13 minutes and half an hour later on?
Yeah, but it wasn't a calm strategy on behalf of our party. This is what I believe should happen, and it's what I said, and what I said there in terms of mental health rocketing. There was over a 10% increase in mental health or antidepressant drug prescriptions over that period of time. The reports coming from the PSNI indicated a much higher rate of domestic violence. All of these things were happening. We did have cardiologists in the Royal saying, we've got a problem here. And consequently, we have considerably more people, dying of heart disease now. So these were actions that we were taking. And this is one thing that I said very often in the executive. There will be more people die as a result of how we responded to COVID than will die of COVID.
Mr. Poots, I believe that's set out in your statement. I just want to end here with that question. Did you consider, when you were sending out those tweets, what the impact would be on the population of Northern Ireland watching the content of that meeting on the evening of the 11th of November?
Well, I considered that the issues as I set them out, particularly the bit that says in terms of the evidential base. Mr. Young, at that time the R rate was 0.7, said the impact of having close contact services, that's the hairdressers and so forth, being allowed to work again, would have been 0.05. So that was the minimal impact that he was suggesting, the chief scientist was suggesting. So the only evidence that was being provided by the chief scientist would have indicated that it wouldn't have been an unreasonable thing to allow those people to re-engage.
Thank you, Milady. I have no questions.
Thank you. Ms Campbell? Thank you. I just got one question, Mr.
Sure.
Poots. In other jurisdictions, I've heard complaints about mass gatherings. You mentioned Cheltenham races. That, of course, was in England. Were there any mass gatherings planned or that took place in Northern Ireland that were of concern to people?
I think, well, there was obviously the Bobby Story funeral, and that's, everybody saw that on television. And that caused an awful lot of pain. And it diminished the role of the Deputy First Minister and the Sinn Féin ministers. And I recognise the apology that was offered by Ms Niculian yesterday for that. And I think that's been the first significant recognition by somebody from that political party to do that, and I commend her for making that apology.
I was thinking more of concerts, sporting matches. There was nothing of that kind in Northern Ireland. It's very much an issue in Scotland, Wales. In
the summer of 2020, there was a lot of sporting events, and those were mainly Gaelic sports because that's whenever they play.
But that's when we were opening up restrictions.
The restrictions were lifted at that point, so they were.
And had there been a plan, supposing there had been a Bruce Springsteen concert about to take place in March 2020, who would have taken the decision, other than the organisers, to whether it would go ahead? You talked about the lack of power in the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. In Wales and Scotland, it would be the then
Yes.
First Ministers. Who would it be here?
In terms of the regulations and so forth, I think that people were being encouraged not to organise those.
Who would say, OK, we've got this concert planned for Thursday night, and we're really worried about COVID? Who would be responsible for that decision? What I'm concerned, in fact, is not just the
I'm
fact
trying to
of
work it
mass
out. I
gatherings.
apologise, my lady, whether it's the local authority or a combination of the Department of Health and Department of Justice.
So with all your experience, you can't work out who would take such an important decision in Northern Ireland?
It certainly never crossed the previous department that I sat upon. My lady, and I
Maybe it's unfair to
apologise for
ask
not
you.
knowing,
No, it's just,
knowing the answer to your question.
I'm trying to work out, obviously I'm learning a lot about the structures in Northern Ireland.
Yes.
It's one of the things where the power to take that kind of decision that could have such an impact on people's lives. And you can't help me, don't worry. Anyway, I tried. Thank you very much. I shall return at 2 o'clock.
All rise.